about touching on what is and what isn't a conspiracy, that sort of concept. But maybe we'll do it over there, that way. The main thing is that the wind is blowing this way, so the mic has to be like that. The way the wind's blowing. I'll start right now. I think it's like that's the mic here, so this needs to be like that. Yeah? And then the mic, it shouldn't get too much, otherwise it'll be constant wind, you know. Okay, just check the sound on that, because one time a little while ago I put the sound on and it went wrong. No, the sound is fine. The sound is fine. Okay. Just get the wind is coming that way, so a little bit further that way. Okay. So I didn't want to speak for too long today, but you never know. It's this corner, you might end up talking for a while. Have you got anything you wanted to ask about first? And then I was thinking about doing something, because I've been accused by all and sundry now of being some sort of conspiracy theorist, and I really wanted to challenge this idea about what is and what isn't a conspiracy. So that was one sort of angle I wanted to go off on, but that's just in my back of my mind.
Mr. Speaker, you highlighted the threat of the virus in the statement there, and you seem to dismiss it. Could you explain your about term?
I was standing here on the 8th of March, having followed the news from China, and it appeared that there was a new virus which had a high death rate and was unknown and people had no immunity to it. Now, I must admit, although I have a doctorate, I have a PhD, it's not in medicine and it's not in epidemiology, it's not in virology. And so I went on the basis of assuming that the stories that were being told about the virology and epidemiology elements of this were correct. And having seen the Chinese respond the way they did, it occurred to me that what's going to happen when they saw what happened in Italy, that the best way was to, because we didn't have immunity, that was my assumption, that the best way was to lock down for 3 weeks, because the virus can only spread, you know, if you catch it, you can only, the maximum period is 14 days. Now they've reduced that to about 6-7 days, actually, probably 10 max, that you can get it and then transmit it. So literally, if you shut down for 3 weeks, it would kill it. So that was my theory. However, I backed that up with the argument that public health in epidemics requires that the community become involved in going into the community, knocking on people's doors and saying, are you okay? Have you got needs that are cut off because of these 3 weeks? And do you also require medical assistance with anything? And that's classical epidemiology developed in Britain after the 1854 cholera epidemic that led to widespread changes in sanitation, in aeration of spaces, in the attitude towards housing, towards environmental pollution, towards sewage, towards the water supply, and so on. So from the cholera epidemic of 1854 emerged epidemiology as a science. It was crude, but that's how it emerged. What they didn't know at the time, or better said, they only began to learn at the time, was give people salt and you could cure them of diarrhea, or at least ameliorate the diarrhea and prevent them from dying. Because the loss of salt is a key thing when you're having diarrhea, which you get from cholera. Anyway, the point was, and there's a book I got this week by a man who has been, if you like, this man has been on telly a few times. He's called John Ashton, and he was a Northern Health expert, public health official in the past. He was very critical of the government throughout. I've read through this book, and although we agree on, the whole audience was there, I said, has anyone got, just measure your temperature a couple of times a day, see if you're ill. Because I said even then, right back at the beginning of March, you cannot transmit if you're asymptomatic. And to this day, that's been the case. And yet the entire international paranoia has been based on the idea that if you're asymptomatic, you can transmit. Now, there is one study from China that shows that there is a possibility of asymptomatic transmission. But when they transmit, when an asymptomatic person transmits, they transmit a low viral load, which means the person who becomes infected does not come down seriously ill. So actually the very best thing in the world is to have asymptomatic transmission. That is how you achieve what a vaccine is supposed to achieve. In other words, a low dosage leads to a response in the body that protects you. Now, what I didn't know, this is my pure ignorance. I didn't know how immunity works. When I first was speaking about this, I had no idea. I subsequently discovered that the overwhelming majority of humanity have always had immunity to this virus. The virus is called SARS-CoV-2, although, again, I didn't know this at the time. I can understand German, I can speak German, I followed the news from Germany and the so-called expert virologists in Germany. In particular, the man who developed the first test for the virus. His name is Dr. Christian Drosten, and he works at the Charité University in Berlin. It's a university hospital. But what we didn't know I didn't know till last week, was that they never had a virus that they were inspecting to make this test from. All that happened was, because a panic, actually probably instigated by the Western media, trying to bring down the Chinese government. And the Chinese government responded by sudden dramatic action, fearing that a health crisis in Wuhan would spread across China and destabilize the authority of the government. Because the West had been trying to use Hong Kong and Xinjiang over a couple of years to undermine the internal stability of China and provoke a revolution, a color revolution, umbrella revolution they called it, in Hong Kong. And so the Chinese reacted, as is characteristic of that particular type of state system. They reacted in dramatic mobilization of resources. But what the Chinese had, coming back to epidemiology and the origin of it in Britain, was boots on the ground. They had people who went round from door to door and asked people every week or more, are you okay? Have you taken your temperature? Can we provide you with what you need? Are you in need of some resources? At no stage since March have I had one knock on the door from any health official in Britain, or even a volunteer. And don't forget, there were 750,000 people who volunteered to help the NHS. They were not used. They didn't go and knock on the doors. They didn't ask people how they are. And instead, the NHS, controlled in fact by the interests of the private economy. The NHS is supposed to be a public health service. But in reality, over the last decades, the NHS has been de facto privatized. And what happened was that public health officials, better said government officials, made decisions that were bureaucratic, that were not based on the history of epidemiology, going on the ground and checking, but they were based instead on bureaucratic decisions. There's old people in the hospital staying too long, kick them into the care homes. That accounts for more than a third of the deaths in Britain. A decision, a policy decision by the government imposed through the NHS. 20,000 deaths, another third of the deaths in Britain, are attributable to other causes. In other words, someone had a heart attack but was too scared to go to hospital. Someone had cancer but was too scared to get it treated. We know that's a fact. These aren't COVID deaths. 20,000 deaths, not COVID related. Another 10% of the total deaths, about 6,000 in Britain, 6,500 maybe, are attributable to infections inside the hospitals. And this is because sick people were brought in. The control mechanisms didn't exist because the hospitals are too full. They don't have community hospitals where they could have segregated those who had an infection from those who did not. And therefore people who are vulnerable, which means those people who have severe comorbidities. One comorbidity, like for example, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. But extreme cases, we're not talking about mild cases. We are talking on average in Britain, don't forget, the deaths in Britain on average are 82 years of age. That's 1 year older than the average life expectancy. So these are people who, one way or another, have severe comorbidities and catch the virus at a high enough dosage. So how many actually died from or with COVID? External to the decision to expel them into the care homes, to the infections which took place as a result of a lack of PPE inside the hospitals and a lack of resources to enable people to be segregated, and of people who died because they didn't get normal treatment. We're talking about a much smaller number. And of that number, 96% of those who died from or with COVID died from a comorbidity interacting with that communicable disease. So in other words, only 6% of those people who died actually died from COVID, not from policy decisions. Only 6% of them died from COVID. Now, there is talk, oh yes, a young person died here, a young person died there, and so on. In total, in the world, or in Britain, about 1 in 1,000 chance that you would have died of COVID this year. 1 in 1,000. That's not a very high chance. There's 1 in 100 chance that you'll die out of the average population. 1 in 100 chance, because about 650,000 people die every year. So, out of the 1,000 people who die, out of 1,000 people, 100 die every year. 100 die every year. Of them, 1. Is that right? Is that the right figure? 100? 1 in 100? No, not 1 in 100. Sorry, wrong. Out of 1,000 people, how many die? 10 people die every year. Of them, 1 person could be attributed to COVID. I've got the statistics here just to show you. This is from the database that registers mortality across Europe. And here you see, these are the charts. You won't be able to see the chart in between, but they're moving around a graph with dotted lines. And this is the average mortality over 5 years. So Austria had no additional deaths. In fact, they had a tiny spike here, or a small spike here, comparable to 2017. But you notice that it is declining. And here you have the idea of second wave. This is the idea of second wave. So this is 2017 here. This is 2020. Here you have Belgium. They did have a spike quite early. Then another spike here, another spike here. But notice, again, Belgium. At the end, the spike is rapidly declining again. The same story, well, Cyprus had no COVID to speak of, nothing. Denmark, nothing. Estonia, nothing. Finland, nothing. France, yes. France had here, again, a spike, so-called second wave, and then a rapid decline in the last couple of weeks. Again. So rapid decline everywhere where this so-called second wave is supposed to be happening. Here you have Germany, nothing at all, nothing. No increase throughout the whole year in deaths, comparable with the last 3 years. 3 I said instead of 5. Greece, nothing. Hungary, nothing. Ireland, a small spike. Slightly larger than 2018, slightly larger than 2017, a small spike in Ireland. None at the moment. It's actually below normal death rate at the moment in Ireland. Because they died earlier.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So why do you think the government is behaving in this way? Like lockdown? I need a conclusion because we know about these numbers. Like, so do you have the answer? Or
Yes, I have the answer.
Okay, we need to listen to your answer, please.
The most important document to read
Yeah.
on the entire crisis, and it is a little bit heavy reading, but make the effort, because just by reading this document, you'll understand the whole story. And I posted it on this website, and anybody wants to look it up, stoppfizer.org. It's very easy to remember, yeah? I posted on that a petition made by Mike Eden. He was one of the former chief scientific officer at Pfizer himself, and also by Dr. Wolfgang von Ark, who exposed the swine flu pandemic in 2009 as a fraud. And at that time, you may remember, some of you may remember, swine flu was declared to be a pandemic. About 13,000 people died in the whole world. And countries like Britain, Germany, America bought tens of millions of doses of vaccines that were rushed out, given emergency permission to be used, and then led to 2,000 cases of narcolepsy in children afterwards. That's why I'm now launching a campaign as well, which will be on the website called vaccineindemnity.com. Vaccineindemnity.com, where we will be launching an inquiry and questioning why it is that Pfizer, whose vaccine has been financed by the British government, financed by the European governments, financed by the American governments, to make private profits for giant pharmaceutical companies to experiment on human beings. That's what it is. It's a pure experiment. Now, if you feel you want to take the vaccine, all I can do is advise you, read up on it first, because when you take a vaccine, a doctor, before they give you a vaccine, is supposed to make sure that you have informed consent. Informed consent means you know the risks and dangers involved in taking this vaccine before it is administered. For example, the NHS published last week advice to practitioners giving the vaccine to patients. And in there it says, as you may know, no one who is pregnant or planning to get pregnant should take the vaccine. And they're refusing to give it to them. But also it says in there, hidden away, it says in there, we do not know if the vaccine will have an impact on fertility. Now, the danger is pointed out in the scientific studies, as I said, by the former scientific director at Pfizer himself, Dr. Mike Eden. There is a real danger that this vaccine, called an mRNA vaccine, will lead to infertility in women. So people like my cousin was asked to take, my niece was asked to take the vaccine the other, she's a nurse, asked to take the vaccine the other day, she refused. The managers then, they strike a black mark against your name. You're no longer going to get promotion. You're no longer going to get a career in the NHS if you refuse. A young woman, perfectly healthy, no need to take a vaccine. And yet they're saying to her, take a vaccine, mRNA vaccine. Now, what's the problem with this? Now, you will have heard that there were studies carried out on a large scale, about 40,000 people, trials of these vaccines. And the way they tested if the vaccine works is they checked, does that person come down with the symptoms of COVID-19, or do they test positive when I stick a little swab up their nose? So in other words, the vaccine's efficacy has been determined by the efficacy of the PCR test. So let's go back to the beginning. The PCR test was invented by Professor Christian Drosten at the Charité University. He published his paper on this test on the 21st, or he wrote it on the 21st of January, but it was published in a peer-reviewed journal called Eurosurveillance, on which he himself is the editor, without peer review in 24 hours. In 24 hours after publication. It was based on the following model.
But what about social distancing?
It's nonsense.
Because
Well, let me come back. Let me come back to that in just a minute. Just a minute, if you don't mind. Just remind me. The PCR test was based on a model of the virus, a computer model sent to them by the Chinese in a panic. They sent it to the world database, which holds all these virus models, virus shapes, the RNA structure, theoretically constructed. On the basis of this theoretical computer model, Drosten designed the test. The problem is, it doesn't differentiate between 6 different bat viruses that can be got by man. Nor does it differentiate between SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2. Nor does it even differentiate or clarify whether you're ill, whether you just have a tiny particle of a broken virus, whether you've had an infection before or not, or whether you are completely asymptomatic and nothing's going to happen to you. So it doesn't tell you anything about your health condition. A test such as the PCR test can only be effective if a doctor examines a patient. How did they identify the illness in the first place in China? They didn't have this test in December. It only came out at the end of January. By that time, China already locked down. So they tested in China by using what's called a CT scan. And the CT scan identified those patients who were said to have COVID-19, which is the disease, not the virus. They confused the thing in all the news. Complete lies. It's totally confused. They say COVID case. They're not COVID cases. They're SARS-CoV-2 positive PCR tests. That's all. It's not an accurate test. However, a CT scan,
What's the accuracy?
if someone, it depends on the circumstances.
So let's say someone's got the virus.
If someone's actually got the virus,
Yes.
it's around a 99% chance, with proper testing in perfect conditions, not these things they do on the street in little tents. Imagine you went to bloody, charge someone with a murder on the basis of some thing swabbed in the street and dropped out and blocked them. No one would take that in a court case. And in fact, in Portugal, this was taken to court recently, and in Portugal it was thrown out that you could quarantine people because of a PCR test.
Well, you don't think
99%. So the
high?
point is this.
You don't think 99% is high then?
99% is high if you've actually got it.
Yeah,
The problem is, what's the chance of identifying you as having it if you don't have it?
False positive.
Right? The false positives, it depends on the actual prevalence. When there's a real epidemic, so when really people are coming down with sick, which you can detect in their lungs through glass-like opacities in the lung, cracked glass-like features in the lung, a double pneumonia. That's basically what it is. The main symptom of COVID-19 is that.
Well,
95% plus
we know they
have
can
that.
be asymptomatic,
Now-
but still
now-
spread the disease. which
They
we
don't
really
spread the
know
disease if they're asymptomatic. It's not true. There is
about.
no
How
evidence.
could you possibly know?
Sorry?
How could you possibly know?
Because there is only one study that confirms asymptomatic transmission in the world. And that study was done in China, and it shows the only transmissions that happened from that transmission were also asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic. So you can't, for example, because it's like this. If I have, let's give an arbitrary figure, 1,000 parts of the virus in each droplet that I cough out of 10 microns in size. If that 10 microns enters your lungs, and the necessary quantity of the virus to become ill is 800, then you will become infected by me. If we're in an enclosed space for more than 10 minutes and I'm talking loudly to you and I cough and then it comes into your lungs when I'm symptomatic, the point is a virus, it multiplies when you're infected. Infection means there's some soreness, redness, cough, irritation that compels you to expel through a cough or makes your throat sore. That's what we mean. I've come down ill with something. I've got a cold. I've got a fever. It's a symptomatic appearance, which means that at that moment when you're symptomatic, you can expel large quantities of the virus because the virus multiplies in your body. And therefore that multiplication is manifest also in the mucus that you expel from your body. If, however, I'm asymptomatic, I have, for example, 100 parts of the virus per 10 microns that I expel from my body when I cough. If you receive that asymptomatic infection, which you may, you will also remain asymptomatic because the quantity of the virus you've ingested will not be capable of multiplying at the same rate that would make you ill.
That sounds like a lovely piece of biology class we've just experienced from you, Heiko. Are you saying that there's no asymptomatic virus ever that is able to transmit?
I didn't say there are no asymptomatic viruses anywhere in the world. I said there is a case. I said there is a case in China which has been studied. There's only been one study.
Your reasoning, we would say
One minute.
disease can only exist when cells are damaged.
Why do you think the governments in Britain and Europe, why do you think the governments in Britain and Europe and around the world quite rapidly decided actually children aren't a danger? Why did they decide that? Because they knew the scientific advice told them children don't come down ill with it. They may transmit it amongst themselves. Remember this.
Hang on a second.
One sec.
You just shot himself in the foot.
Sorry?
You're saying children don't come down with it.
Yes,
but they still can
asymptomatic
spread
transmission
it.
doesn't make you ill.
Yes, but if a kid spread it to an adult,
They don't spread it to adults because they're asymptomatic themselves.
Yeah, but you said
And if
they
they do
spread
spread
it
it to an adult, the adult will also become asymptomatic. In other words, immune. Immunity is not based. This is my mistake at the beginning. That was my big mistake. I didn't understand immunity. I wasn't a medical expert. I'm not now, but I'm more medical expert than a lot of people now. Right? Particularly on this question. Immunity is composed of two arms. The human body, when it's infected with an agent, a bacteria or a virus, responds by producing antibodies to that virus and fighting it off. Right? But antibodies only last for a short period of time. They last from, in the case of SARS-CoV-2, a maximum of 60 days. Back in May or June this year, it was shown through antibody tests in London that 17% of the London population had already been infected with the virus. The overwhelming majority, 90% of them, completely asymptomatically. They did not know they had had the virus. But actually, it was far more than that. London has already probably had 50% of the population infected with the virus, because the antibodies are only visible and detectable for 60 days.
Where you
Now,
get the data from?
I mean, I can show you here. I mean, this is not an academic class, right? If you want to go on the YouTube channel, I have got all the data and all the references
It has to
there.
be academic.
Well-
With numbers, it has to be academic.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't have a PowerPoint here. So if you want, no, I'm sorry, I've got a PhD. I've studied,
If you have a PhD.
no, because you're asking what's the credibility of my data.
Absolutely.
And I can only confirm that by referring to documents. And by referring to documents, we're moving away from a speech in Hyde Park into an academic debate, which requires documentary cross-exchange. So I will refer to the experts who I think are the best in the field. I will refer to the experts I consider to be the best in the field and that I have drawn the data from. Number one, the man who is probably the top epidemiologist in the world, his name is John Ioannidis, Stanford University. Second, Wolfgang Vodder, former SPD Member of Parliament, lung expert in Germany, manager of an epidemic sentinel in southern Germany for many years. He exposed the swine flu pandemic and that was caused by the interest of the World Health Organization connected with Big Pharma, promoting their drugs rather than a real pandemic. third person I would refer you to would be Sucharit Bhakti, former professor in Germany. He's taught 12,000 doctors. He's a microbiologist. He also exposed the swine flu pandemic and the Creutzfeldt-Jakob pandemic, which was no pandemic. You all remember we were told we're all going to die of BSE. Only a few people died of BSE, and yet they slaughtered millions of cows in Britain. Right? Now, look at last week. They announced on the BBC that all poultry in Britain now has to be, as you as that man was socially isolated. Now all poultry in Britain is socially isolated. There's no more free-range chickens anymore. They've all been inside the boxes because of an outbreak of some sort of bird flu. Don't forget there were also millions of mink killed in the last couple of months in Sweden, in Denmark, in Holland, and in Madrid. Sorry, in Spain. Why were they killed? Because they said, "Oh my God, we stuck a PCR test up the nose of a mink, and we found they can have the virus." What Sucharit Bhakti explained, what I thought was very profound, he said the following: these viruses have been around for millennia. They move between man and animal. That's how the mink caught it, or we caught it perhaps the mink, we don't know. They found it in cats. They found it in mink. They found it in bats. They found it in humans. How many other mammals can catch it? Have they tested the squirrels? Have they tested every dog in Britain? No. Have they tested all the cats in people's homes? The hamsters, the rats? Have they? No, they have not. We know the macaque can get it because they gave it to the macaque as an experiment. We know rats can get it because they're giving it to rats in experiments. And therefore these things move between man and animal. And I say to you this, the proof for the pudding is in the eating. Where did they get the lowest rates of death? Africa and India. The lowest rate, 9 times fewer deaths in India per capita than Britain. Why? You really think they socially distance in the slums of Mumbai? In the slums of Delhi? And yet in Mumbai, the most densely populated slum in the world is located in Mumbai. And yet, 80% have tested positive for having had the virus. Hardly anybody dies. Why? Because they have immunity already. The T cells in their body have been exposed to all sorts of diseases throughout their lives. If they were to die of one of those diseases, they die in the first year or two of their life. They have a high childhood infant mortality in India and in Africa. But if they make it through, and they can cope with those viruses and bacteria in their environment, where there's no clean water, where there's no clean sewage, where washing your hands is impossible, where there's no sanitizer everywhere, where face masks are useless because of this humidity. The idea that people socially distance in India is a myth. And last week there was a general strike in India. 250 million workers came out on a general strike because the billionaires are robbing the people of India. They drove hundreds of millions of migrant workers out of the cities with batons and poisoned them with spray to drive them out of the cities. Many were forced to walk hundreds of miles to their home cities. And even then, hardly anybody in India died. Now ask yourself this, they all talk about Sweden. The Swedish, it's a very organised, advanced, industrialised society. So instead of, we have to compare control groups, you know. Control groups. That's how you do a proper scientific experiment. This person is injected with this person is not. We have it on a large scale, and then we know, does this science have fact in it? Or do they all come down the same amount of death? So where is the control group? Everyone was talking about Sweden. Actually, no. The control group is here. the police force in Britain have 140,451 officers. None of them socially distanced in March, in February, in April, and in May. None of them. In fact, they didn't wear masks until I think late April or May, until they came to arrest us all in the park. They didn't wear masks, that's true. And when they wear them, it's always the usual thing, up and down, under your nose, put it up again, keep putting it, useless. Masks are useless except for momentary occasions. If you went into a really busy club and everyone was dancing around and singing around, and you suffer, let's say, from heart disease, serious heart disease, okay, put a mask on when you enter that club, if you spend more than 10 minutes there. But the real issue, how you could have resolved that, was very simple. Air motion. It was known from the beginning, from March, that you have to spend 10 minutes within a metre of someone in an enclosed environment to catch it. 10 minutes, minimum. Now, given those circumstances, why did so few people catch it on aeroplanes? Because in aeroplanes, the air is changed 10 times an hour. So in other words, the air is changed, so with it, you can't have that 10-minute interaction that lets you get infected. Why did the police not come down ill? One police officer retired out of 140,451 died. One police officer, and he had a heart problem, a severe heart disease. So 800, according to their official figures, 800 police officers tested positive out of 140,000. So nothing. Why did the police not drop down dead all around us? Because, and unfortunately this is where I was wrong, because I didn't understand about T-cell immunity. 80%, they've shown in blood tests in a study in Tübingen University by the leading experts on immunology and T-cells. They showed that blood samples from before COVID was known to exist. From 2009, I think, to 2017, they took past blood samples, they tested their response, T-cell response to the virus. And they found 80% of samples from pre-COVID times, the T-cell response destroyed the virus. So in other words, we've always had herd immunity, all along. The people who are susceptible are over 70 with severe comorbidities. So what we should have done is protect those people and let the rest of the population get on with their lives.
Okay.
That would have been the optimal solution to the entire thing. And the police are proof of that. The police are 100% inside our country. We don't need to look at Sweden or India even for that. Just the police. Has there been a study of the police? Of why they didn't get it? Of why they haven't come down ill?
Yeah.
Of why they haven't caught the virus? Of why they're not sick? No, there has not. And by the way, despite the fact that generally police are reasonably fit, I know from the last few weeks' shenanigans when the police arrested me 3 times in one day, 2 times at Speaker's Corner as well, and then chased me at Speaker's Corner. I know that even though I'm 57 years of age, some of the police officers are not very fit. I mean, you see them running. Only one tried to run after me. The rest of them were like, every time I turned up in the park, they were like this. They'd turn around. In the park, and they were going like this. It was like the return of the zombies. Every time I turned the corner, they tried. It's ridiculous. And then, so some of the police officers are obese. Some of the police officers are a bit lazy. But nevertheless, despite that, hardly any police officers came down sick. So that's proof for the pudding. But had we done nothing except protect the old or the really seriously in danger, care homes, that's 25,000 out of 65,000. Had we kept the hospitals open, that's another 20,000 people who died unnecessarily from not going to hospital. And by the way, Ilionides, Stanford professor who's the leading expert on epidemiology in the world, he pointed out that got my friend, sorry. What was I saying? Yeah, before that. Police officers. I can't remember. I'll come back to that in a minute. Sorry. I really lost it. Social distancing, someone asked me. I mean, as I pointed out, they never told you the truth. The truth was quite simple. 1 meter distance, 10 minutes. For someone who's got a serious comorbidity, that's a danger. If you're ill, don't visit them. If you're not ill, it's not going to matter. So it's not complicated. If you're ill, don't visit Granny who's ill. If you've got a cough, don't hide it and say, oh, I'm all right. Don't visit Granny then. But cancel Christmas. Tier 3 lockdown, go into a pub with a mask on, and then sit down and take it off. And go to the toilet and put it on. Oh, for fuck's sake, you idiots. Utter lunacy. They got signs, look at those blue barriers. Put there under orders from Sadiq Khan. Put them all down. Close the streets off. Widen the cycle lanes. Everyone must cycle. Right? And on the signs over there it says 2 meter distance. As if walking past someone on the street at 2 meters is going to infect someone. It's utter and complete nonsense. It always was nonsense. So that's space. Even hands, you know. In the history of epidemiology, about 150 years ago, it was discovered that washing your hands can help spread disease. But not what we're doing now. That's madness. It's like everybody has suddenly become Lady Macbeth. LPC people everywhere going like this. Every come to the shop, do like this. Come to go out the shop, do like this. Go to the restaurant, do like this. Have a pint of beer, do like this. Go to the toilet, go like this. Do like this. Every couple of seconds, people washing there with sanitizer. And then you go in the bloody tube station and they got adverts for Dettol. Masquerading as the provision of sanitizer for the population. And I hope you've all heard the Christmas album viral video that's going round. You know, sanitizers coming to town. That's that one they got there. And this other one, Johnny Mathis, isn't it? He goes, this is what comes to pass when a mask is worn. And all this sort of stuff. So the fact of the matter is, the PCR test was flawed. Based on that PCR test, a panic was made. The panic spread around the world because the Chinese were scared. The Chinese were scared because the Americans were trying to overthrow the government. And therefore they reacted immediately and dramatically to try and keep calm. The Italians got scared because they panicked and they triaged people. Old people who were on the edge of dying, they were put in circumstances where they feared going to hospital. And by the way, one of the main reasons why people, if they die of COVID-19 and they're under 70 years of age, the main reason is stress. If you have a high stress level, then you may, even as a young person, die of COVID-19. That's why you see Li Wenliang, the doctor in China, the eye doctor in China, who posted his WeChat thing and then was interviewed by the police. Don't forget, remember this. Li Wenliang posted a WeChat post to 6 other doctors. The Chinese government didn't like it because he said it's a new SARS. They interviewed him, the police interviewed him, and he got scared because suddenly he looked like he was an opponent of the government in China, and that's not an easy role, right? That's dangerous for him. And so naturally he had a massively elevated stress level. Then when he caught the virus, he died. Now, I have been standing at Speaker's Corner talking about the vaccine, talking about government policies, talking about the death rate, shifting my view from lockdown to release of lockdown and to no lockdown at all, based on understanding of the science of immunology and based on understanding of what actually happened in different parts of the world and in different control groups, police, as opposed to normal people. And my conclusions changed according to that. But you see, what was I saying? The Chinese lockdown, the Italians lockdown, the British lockdown, and I called for that again, I said for 3 weeks. Boots on the ground is what we should have had. That would have resolved the problem then. But the problem is, once the government had embarked on a particular policy, what it meant was they took 400 billion pounds from you, from your taxes, from the future, and your children's taxes. They took that 400 billion and they threw it willy-nilly to their buddies and friends, the people who you call the kleptocracy around COVID. Dominic Cummings, his mates, his allies, Matt Hancock, his mates, his allies. I mean, they're not even, they're so brazen about it. He even gave a contract for making a bloody glass tubes to his mate who runs a pub round the corner. That's how corrupt it is. And then, having spent this money, vaccines, having bought tens of millions of doses of these vaccines before they'd been made, and offered 100% indemnity against the vaccine. So in other words, if you get a vaccine from Pfizer and you have like these 2 allergic reaction people, a severe illness as a consequence of that, then the government doesn't.
Even if they die, they can't be taken to court.
Pfizer cannot be taken to court. All you can claim is £120,000 maximum from the government. So if someone dies or someone gets a long illness, now note this: official statistics for COVID deaths in Britain are from or with COVID, having determined by having a positive PCR test in the last 28 days. So if you have a positive PCR test and you die within 28 days, you are a COVID death. But what about with the vaccine? If you have the vaccine and you die within 28 days, are you a vaccine death? Are you? What about if you die in 2 years and you suddenly come down after the vaccine? Because most people who get the vaccine feel really ill. There was a guy on Daily Mail, he described he was in the trials. He got what he called a severe hangover the next day and the day after, 2 days. Most people get fever, or they get severe hangover, or myalgia, just general feeling of illness. And in order to counteract that, they give you 1,000 grams of paracetamol. 1,000 milligrams of paracetamol. It's a very high dosage of paracetamol to overcome the vaccine. So they make you ill with the vaccine, when most people without the vaccine don't come down ill. 90% of people who get COVID, who get SARS-CoV-2, do not come down ill. So now Ilionides made a very good point. And that was, he said, why have we based our statistics on the worst case scenarios in every case? Because if you do that, now he said you can do that, but only if you also add into the parameters of your calculation the worst case scenario for other events associated. So if you lock down, how many people will not go for cancer treatment? What's the maximum for that? How many people will suffer a heart attack and not go to the doctor? What's the maximum for that? How many people will lose their jobs and become mad? How many families will they be killed? Will someone commit suicide in? Or someone be beaten up in? How many divorces will happen? And people get ill because of that? How many long-term lives have been destroyed? How many, this was the point from Ilionides, how many years of quality life have been lost as a consequence of lockdown, as compared with those who died of COVID-19, who are averaging 1 year older than the normal average age of death in Britain. So you're talking, if someone with cancer, if it's caught early, an average life expectancy of 12 years. But with COVID-19, in someone of 82 years of age, the average life expectancy is perhaps a month, 2 months, 5 months, 6 months longer. Perhaps a year, perhaps 10 max. But it's nothing like the average as a whole for 12 years for cancer. And yet, I know people myself who have not got the treatment. I've needed things going to the hospital. I haven't got. There were tests they should have done to another me. 4 cancers. do this once you've had a colonoscopy. So they have to test you every year. I haven't had a test. They didn't even set an appointment up. So how many quality life years have been lost as a consequence of the lockdown? And in fact, there is truth to the argument that a faction of the ruling class have lost all connection with reality. The tech giants, the pharma giants, integrated together in their interests. Bill Gates, Apple, Amazon, the Pfizer, what's this called? The Oxford vaccine, what's it called? AstraZeneca. These giant multinationals, they've been dreaming of controlling mankind's, of meeting mankind's needs electronically. So instead of going to school, you sit on a computer. Instead of meeting someone and having a love affair, you have a remote love affair on a computer. Instead of doing work in a workplace where you meet with people, you do it on a computer. Instead of coming to speakers call, you watch on a computer. So in other words, everything you do is all day long, all night long. Turn that off, work over, entertain. Meanwhile, everything you do becomes the property of global corporate elites who own the data. The world has become, they say, data is the new oil, data is the new gold, data is the new platinum. So what is the vaccine they're offering us? It is a computer programmed theoretical construct made into an RNA vaccine they implant into the cell because it's cheap to make. It can be designed around any possible virus you could imagine. So as soon as this problem, the fact of the matter is, if Eden is correct, Mike Eden, former scientific advisor, chief scientific advisor of Pfizer, if he's correct, and if Ilionides is correct, if the leading experts in the world are correct on the field, but they're all called conspiracy theorists nowadays, but they act to be the leading experts, if they are correct, the epidemic was over in June. And if the epidemic was over in June, the epidemic of testing has produced the results we've got today. The epidemic of fear, the epidemic of lockdown, that's what's produced the deaths at the moment. And of course, they can up them and down them. I was saying, people are asking me, oh, we're going to go into tier 3 in London next week. I don't know. I fear for the worst. Simply because I think it's true that in London, there is a significant skepticism. People might say, okay, good, they made the vaccine. You take it first. I'll take it when I see what happens to you. I don't want to take it myself yet. Let's just have a little wait. Even though William Shakespeare took it, you know, second man to take it, William Shakespeare. I think the Queen's going to take it on Christmas Day in front of the whole population of the country, and Prince Philip will take it. You know, I'm sure they will. I'm sure they'll all get the real vaccine. Take it. But you see, the problem is this. In order to create the atmosphere necessary for the population to say, give us the vaccine, give us the vaccine, give us the vaccine, they have to make people scared. They have to make us live in fear. That, of course, is why they may do another lockdown. Not because the lockdown is any good. They know it'll in fact destroy the economy again. But you see, they may do it nevertheless. I don't know. I hope to God they don't. But they made, in Germany, they're doing it over Christmas. Lunatics. And in Germany, there have been no additional deaths in the entire year in Germany. It's madness. But it reflects the power of the pharma industry. By the way, the man who invented the test, Christian Drosten. You know, there's a fund, it's farcical, there's a fund now which you can put into. And it's presently, yesterday it was at £40,000 to give to Christian Drosten if he can prove that his test works. His own test. And yet he's completely silent, he hides away. He says, I'm being threatened, I'm being threatened. What he's being threatened with is the fact he's been lying all along. And he's a charlatan. And they believe the charlatan. What we are experiencing with this mask wearing, with this hysteria, with the lockdowns, with governments demanding you take vaccines. What you're experiencing is the destruction of reason, the destruction of logic, the destruction of rationality. We have a world turned literally insane, carrying out practices that are insane. Hugging is normal, natural. Shaking hands is normal and natural. Kissing a lover is normal and natural. Meeting people is normal and natural. But they've been keeping at this for so long that people are forgetting what is normal to be a human being. We are forgetting it. And we're being sucked into the cyber world, on telephones, on computers, dominated by multinational companies who seize control of the internet, both as a mechanism of spying on us, as a mechanism of censoring us, of a mechanism of controlling us, of a mechanism of work, education, sex. For God's sake, they're destroying humanity. And it's because these billionaires lose touch with reality themselves. That's why you get these mad ideas from Elon Musk. Put 1,000 probes in your brain and intercommunicate with the world. No thanks. I've got my own brain as it is. I don't need 1,000 probes in my brain to communicate with someone. I can do it without. But these people, you just launch a bloody spaceship in the middle of the pandemic. Launches a spaceship in prep to go to Mars. To go to Mars for what? For what, for God's sake? Well, exactly, it's his business. That's the point. That's the point. But the problem is this. None of these things are our business. Nothing that determines our lives are our business anymore. They can turn around and say, you can't be in more than 2. Only 2 weeks ago, they were arresting us. I was arrested here on the 28th of November 3 times for being in a group of more than 2. Then when the police detained me, I said, what was the charge? He said, Corona. I said, Corona what? He said, not wearing a mask. I said, not wearing a mask is not a crime. Then he arrested me again. He said, what's the charge now? He says, I'm carrying a megaphone. The police station, when he got there, the police officer said, carrying a megaphone is not a crime. So they're inventing it as they go along and turning the police into agents of idiocy. Trying to turn the world into some sort of technical utopia. The reason they want the mRNA vaccine is because it's easy to make, and they've been dreaming of this for years. Identify a gene or an RNA of an illness, bacteria, virus, make a theoretical computer construct, implant it into the human being. Therefore you can have a jab for everything. And these lunatics, my friend studies the billionaires of Russia and their psychology. She wrote a book called Rich Russians. And when she met with those people, these billionaires, you know what they think? They think about eternal life. They have cryogenic places where they keep, when they die, they keep their body in cryogenic conditions, hoping that in 100 years' time or 50 years' time they can inject them and revive them. There they will be again with all their billions waiting for them. That's the madness these people have in their minds. And they think by vaccinating, using these new vaccines, they'll be able to cure mankind of every disease under the sun. Of course, it will end in disaster. We have to fight it tooth and nail. I've spoken enough for today. Thanks very much.
Exactly an hour.
Oh, there you go. That's enough for today. See you another day.